Perhaps, when viewed from above, Saudi Arabia looks like a modern-day miracle. On one side is an endless sea of sand where the heat doesn't just feel uncomfortable, but could bring everything to a halt without technological intervention. An environment where, by natural logic, people are meant to pass through, not settle down. And yet, right in the middle of that landscape, cities rise, glass towers reflecting the sun. Mega projects worth trillions of dollars emerging from the sand, as if nature were just a minor detail that could be dealt with later. For decades, this seems to have created an almost unshakable belief. When oil money is large enough, nearly every limitation can be negotiated. Too hot? Turn up the air conditioning. Too dry? Desalinate seawater. Too remote? Build an entirely new city. But have you ever wondered what happens when money, perhaps, no longer solves everything? When the cost of overcoming nature begins to rise faster than the advantage of the resource itself? When a model that once ran smoothly seems to approach limits that few people noticed before? Stay with us until the end to see the full picture. Oil has long been more than just a resource. It seems to function as a kind of guarantee of power, something that, at least for a long time, could help solve nearly any economic problem if you had enough of it. And in that picture, Saudi Aramco has likely always been seen as the clearest symbol. A nearly unstoppable money-making machine, operating steadily through global shifts, giving the impression that oil revenue was almost impossible to run out of. But at this point, that feeling no longer seems as certain as it once did. In reality, oil likely hasn't gone anywhere. The world still consumes it every day. Gas-powered cars still dominate the roads. And for many people, especially older generations in the US, the idea of oil disappearing may still feel more like a distant prediction than an ongoing reality. But the world, by many signs, appears to be shifting, not completely, not evenly, and certainly not always logically. Still, the signs are there. More electric vehicles, changing energy policies, and increasingly common discussions about a carbon-free future. For some, this may feel like a passing trend. But for economies heavily dependent on oil, it seems to create a quiet pressure. In the past, oil revenue wasn't just income. It functioned like a thick financial cushion capable of absorbing almost any shock. Energy subsidies, public spending, massive development projects, all of it seems to have been built on a simple assumption. The cash flow would always be large enough to sustain the system. But if that flow remains large, yet no longer as abundant as before, then things may begin to change. And this might feel familiar. When a resource once seen as stable begins to slow down, what used to be default starts to become conditional. Subsidies are reassessed, spending requires more calculation, and the sense of financial security, while not gone, may no longer feel as solid. In Saudi Arabia's case, this process appears to be unfolding quietly. A system that once ran smoothly on oil revenue may now be adapting to a new reality, where that resource, while still massive, is no longer enough to cover every risk. There's a certain irony in that, isn't there? A country built on oil is now investing heavily to reduce its dependence on that very resource. Not because it's disappearing, but perhaps because it can no longer carry the entire system on its own. And as the oil era shifts, what does life in Saudi Arabia begin to look like? Can it still be seen as one of the safer places in the Middle East for people to come and live? Stay with us to find out. Setting aside the issue of oil, we now turn to a more direct question: whether Saudi Arabia is truly a suitable place to live, and the first thing that likely needs to be addressed is the climate. For many people, especially those who have experienced long, sweltering summers in places like Texas or Arizona, heat has long been a familiar part of life. It can be uncomfortable. It can drive up electricity bills, but overall, it still feels manageable. You step indoors, turn on the air conditioning, and things seem to return to normal. But in places like Jeddah, that sense of heat appears to be pushed to a different threshold, one that may no longer resemble what many people have experienced before. It's not just high temperatures, but the combination of heat and humidity, creating what scientists refer to as wet bulb temperature. It may sound technical, but the meaning is fairly direct. When the air is both hot enough and humid enough, the human body seems to lose its ability to cool itself effectively. At that point, being outdoors is no longer just uncomfortable. It can become a real risk, at least if exposure lasts long enough. And this, even if not always openly stated, appears to be starting to affect how a society functions. Outdoor work, once a normal part of development and construction, seems to be adjusting. Working hours are reduced, the pace slows down, and in some cases, it may no longer be feasible during the hottest parts of the day. For anyone who has worked outside or has seen a job site in the middle of summer, this may not be hard to imagine. It's not that the work can't be done, but it can't be done the old way anymore. But perhaps the more noticeable shift lies in everyday life. By many signs, life seems to be retreating indoors into enclosed, fully climate-controlled spaces. Shopping malls, offices, cars, all form an ecosystem where people can exist without prolonged direct exposure to the outside environment. At first glance, this might be seen as technological progress, even a sign of development. But on closer look, there may be a subtle, almost ironic contradiction. Life continues smoothly, as long as you don't truly have to face the natural environment. And when that becomes the default condition, electricity appears to take on a different meaning. It's no longer just a convenience, but seems to be turning into a form of survival infrastructure. Air conditioning is not simply for comfort, it is, in many ways, maintaining a livable state. As long as the system runs reliably, everything stays under control. But if there is any disruption, even briefly, that balance could be tested. For those who have experienced power outages during summer, this may feel familiar, only here the level of dependence appears deeper. You don't turn on the AC just to feel better, you may be turning it on to feel normal. And this leads to a conclusion that is somewhat difficult to avoid. Technically, people can still live under these conditions. Technology seems to allow it. But instead of adapting to the environment, people appear to rely on technology to buy back their ability to adapt through electricity, infrastructure, and a system that must function almost perfectly at all times. Do you think you could handle a climate this extreme? Let us know below. From the outside, Saudi Arabia may still look like one of the few places in the world where energy feels almost limitless. Oil continues to flow, extraction facilities remain active, and the name Saudi Aramco still evokes the image of a money-making machine that many economies could only dream of. For a long time, this seemed to lead to a simple assumption. If you have enough energy, then the cost of energy is no longer a concern. It becomes a foundation, almost a given, rather than something to worry about. But there may be a catch here. That assumption doesn't fully reflect reality. Electricity demand, by many signs, appears to be rising not because of explosive industrial growth or massive expansion in production, but largely to serve a very basic need: cooling. As the climate becomes more extreme, air conditioning is no longer just a choice for comfort. It may be becoming a requirement for maintaining a normal life. This creates a somewhat uncomfortable loop. The hotter it gets, the greater the need for cooling. The more cooling is required, the higher the demand for electricity. And as that demand reaches a certain level, energy once seen purely as an advantage seems to take on a different role, something that must be continuously consumed just to keep things from slipping out of control. For many people, including perhaps you watching this may not feel entirely unfamiliar. An especially hot summer, rising electricity bills, and the sense that you're paying not to live better, but simply to maintain normal. In Saudi Arabia, that feeling appears to be amplified several times over. What makes this even more thought-provoking is how the country seems to be responding. Rather than relying solely on oil, there appears to be increasing investment in renewable energy, solar power, green projects, and broader efforts to diversify supply. At first glance, this may seem like a logical, even necessary step. But from another angle, it carries a hint of irony. A country rich in oil, now working to reduce its dependence on the very resource that built its strength. Perhaps the issue isn't a lack of resources, but the cost of using them. As more energy is consumed domestically, especially for basic needs like cooling, the portion available for export, for profit, for long-term investment, may no longer feel as abundant as before. And at that point, energy is no longer just a strategic advantage. It seems to become part of the operating cost, something that must be sustained continuously to keep life from becoming more difficult. This doesn't necessarily signal a crisis. Everything is still running, cities are still lit, and the system appears to be functioning. But the sense of ease once associated with energy, wealth may gradually be giving way to a more complex reality. That even in one of the most resource-rich places on Earth, energy is not entirely free, at least not in the way many once assumed. Perhaps if we go back a few years, the phrase Vision 2030 carried a very familiar feeling for many who follow the global economy, a large, clear, and highly ambitious plan to reshape the entire economy of Saudi Arabia. It wasn't just about growth. It seemed to be an effort to rewrite how a country operates when it no longer wants to rely too heavily on oil. And at the center of that story, names like Neom and the Line appeared as symbols, a futuristic city in the desert, A linear urban stretch spanning hundreds of kilometers, where technology, clean energy, and modern design seem to merge into one. For many people, especially American audiences who have witnessed major development waves at home, that feeling may sound familiar, like when a project is introduced with the promise that it will change everything. But now, things may be shifting. It seems that the scale of some projects has been adjusted. What was once described as a hundreds of kilometers urban corridor now appears to be implemented in smaller phases. Not canceled, but perhaps moving more slowly. And from a financial perspective, this may not be entirely surprising. Because no matter how large the resources are, projects of this scale seem to come with a familiar question: what is the real cost, and how long will it take to generate returns? This is the kind of question many American viewers, especially those who have followed real estate cycles, major infrastructure projects, or state-level development plans, are likely very familiar with. There is a sense here that feels quite recognizable. When things begin, the vision is wide, almost without limits. But as implementation begins, the numbers start to appear: budgets, cash flow, return timelines. And step by step, the plan seems to be brought back down to earth. What's interesting is that, on closer look, this may not necessarily be a negative sign. It appears that instead of pursuing a limitless vision, the system is shifting toward a more practical approach, breaking down risks, adjusting expectations, and perhaps prioritizing components that can generate value sooner. For many, this sounds very familiar, even somewhat normal in the way mature economies tend to operate. And perhaps this is where a subtle sense of irony begins to emerge. Because while the world once looked at these projects as symbols of an almost limitless future, reality seems to suggest something much simpler. Even the largest plans, in the most resource-rich economies, still have to follow very old rules: cost, efficiency, and time. For American audiences, especially those who have lived through multiple economic cycles, this may not be surprising. If anything stands out, it may be that sense of familiarity that whether in the Middle East or North America, whether in deserts or cities, large-scale projects ultimately face the same realities. And seen this way, Vision 2030 does not appear to be failing. It may simply be evolving from a symbolic dream into an operational plan. If there is one thing that may have once felt hard to believe for many people, especially those who have spent most of their careers in tax-based, cost-driven economies, it might be the idea of a place where life seemed to be supported at a very high level. Not everything was free, but the overall feeling appeared to be close to it. For many years, Saudi Arabia seems to have operated under a model like that. Low energy prices, broad subsidies, and a system where the cost of living did not fully reflect the true value of what was being consumed. For those used to every dollar being tied to taxes, insurance, and bills, this may have sounded like an alternate version of reality. But like many things in life, there comes a point when change happens, and it seems that point may be now. One of the most visible changes is likely the introduction of value-added tax (VAT). From a system with almost no direct consumption tax, things begin to carry a more real price. At the same time, some subsidy programs also appear to be adjusted. Not completely removed, but perhaps no longer as broad as before. The result? Perhaps a very familiar feeling: living costs begin to rise in ways that are difficult to ignore. Electricity bills, housing costs, daily expenses, all seem to be shifting in a direction that those who once lived under a heavily subsidized system can clearly feel. And here, the middle class appears to be the group that feels this shift most directly. These are people who are not struggling enough to adapt immediately, but also not comfortable enough to ignore prolonged changes. For many, the experience may feel similar to periods of economic adjustment in the US, when costs rise steadily, but income does not always keep pace at the same rate. For younger people, the situation may be even more complex. The job market seems to be becoming more competitive not only because of a growing young population, but also because the economy itself is shifting. Jobs that once felt stable may no longer be as guaranteed, while new sectors require different skills and time to adapt. But perhaps the most interesting perspective comes from the expatriate community expats. By many analyses, Saudi Arabia may still offer highly attractive income levels. In some sectors, after-tax income appears to exceed that of many developed markets. When income is high and the environment seems to carry less financial pressure, people may tend to spend more freely. Not because they lack financial awareness, but perhaps because the surrounding system makes everything feel more stable than it actually is, a kind of sense of security that, in hindsight, may not be entirely sustainable. And then, as factors like taxes, living costs, and policy changes become more visible, some may begin to realize that saving something that once seemed easy does not unfold as expected. You see, it's not that the systems are the same, but the feeling can be more similar than people assume. Earning money in many cases may not be the hardest part. The harder part may be keeping it maintaining stability over time in an environment that is constantly changing. It's something worth thinking about, isn't it? Because when a system shifts from support toward greater self-responsibility, the challenge is no longer just about opportunity. It seems to lie in the ability to adapt managing spending, understanding risk, and most importantly, not getting carried away by the feeling that things will always be as easy as they once seemed. Have you ever tried living a day without access to clean water? We'd be willing to guess that if you've spent enough time in places where water is simply there when you turn on the tap, it's hard to imagine a system where water doesn't truly exist naturally, but has to be produced, liter by liter. In Saudi Arabia, especially in Riyadh, reality appears to operate in exactly that way. The city isn't located next to a major river, nor does it have abundant fresh water in the traditional sense. Instead, most of its water supply seems to come from desalination plants, where seawater is processed into water suitable for daily use. It sounds modern, and it is technologically, this may be one of the most advanced systems in the world. But from another angle, it also raises a fairly fundamental question. What happens when the most essential need, water, depends almost entirely on a complex industrial process? This may be the point where many American viewers, especially those accustomed to stable infrastructure systems, begin to feel a certain level of discomfort. Not because the system doesn't work, but because it appears to have very few alternatives. When water comes from multiple sources, rivers, lakes, groundwater risk is usually distributed. But when it is concentrated within a single large system, no matter how advanced, the risk seems to concentrate as well. It doesn't have to be a major failure. Sometimes, even a small disruption in the chain energy supply, maintenance, or any link in the system can create noticeable pressure. And because water is not something that can be postponed, even minor interruptions can be felt very quickly. There is a clear contrast here. If energy, oil, electricity can be seen as a kind of cost, something that can rise or fall with the market, then water seems to carry a different nature. It is not just a cost. It appears to be a limit. You can pay more for energy, you can adjust how you consume it, but with water, especially in a harsh natural environment, the options seem far more limited. While many once looked at Saudi Arabia and saw a country with almost no limits in terms of resources, at least when it comes to energy, the reality seems to suggest something more nuanced. Not all resources are interchangeable. You can have a great deal of energy, but to turn that energy into water, the thing required for daily life, you still need a system that is stable, continuous, and with very little room for error. For those who have experienced moments when infrastructure became an issue, even brief power outages or service disruptions, this feeling may not be unfamiliar. But here, it seems to exist on a larger scale, and with a deeper level of dependence. While the world often talks about energy as the defining factor of national strength, in this case, water may quietly be what defines the true limit. Perhaps, if the entire story had to be summarized from a more familiar perspective, what is happening doesn't exactly feel like an ending, at least not in the way many might imagine. There is no single moment of collapse. Instead, it appears to be a gradual transition, but one deep enough to change how things operate. The climate seems harsher, the cost of living appears to be moving closer to its real value, and the oil model, once seen as an almost irreplaceable foundation, may also be adjusting under new pressures. On a personal level, these are no longer distant concepts. They begin to influence financial decisions and long-term plans. For now, Saudi Arabia still seems to be there, still functioning, still developing, still attracting opportunities. But at the same time, it also appears to be becoming something different from what it once was. A place where, perhaps, you have to pay more to maintain the same standard of living. A place where adaptation is no longer optional but seems necessary. And a place where relying entirely on the system may no longer feel as certain as it once did. So is this a successful adaptation of a major economy, or just the early stages of a deeper, longer shift? If you had the opportunity to work here, would you be willing to make that trade-off and step into a system that appears to be in transition? One last thing. This video is not intended to predict the future, but rather to provide a different perspective on existing geopolitical risks. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing is not what is about to happen, but rather what we believe will never happen. Thank you for watching until the end. See you in the next videos.